Okay, so everyone knows Scary Movie, right? I mean, you've probably seen it a bunch of times and laughed your way through it. But we're going to do a deep dive today. We're going to go deeper than just the jokes. Like, why is this movie so funny? Why did it work when it came out back in 2000? And does it even hold up today? So to help us figure this out, we're going to be checking out a video essay from Prim's Hood Cinema. So yeah, let's unpack this comedic masterpiece.
Yeah. Scary Movie. I think one of the most fascinating things is that it's not just straight parody. It's like parody on top of parody, you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Because if you think about it, it's mostly making fun of Scream, right?
Right.
But Scream itself is kind of already making fun of horror movie tropes.
Yeah.
So it's like the Wayans brothers are doing commentary on top of commentary.
Oh, that's a good point. So does that make it funnier? Or does it get too, like, I don't know, convoluted or like too meta?
Well, I think that's what's so brilliant about Scary Movie.
Yeah.
It manages to find this balance. Like, you've got the scene where Ghostface calls Drew Barrymore's character at the beginning, like in Scream.
Uh-huh.
It's parodying that.
Yeah.
But then they add these, like, absurd elements. Like, the killer can't figure out the caller ID.
Right.
So dumb.
And then there's the "what's up, bitch"
Yeah.
line.
Yes.
It comes out of nowhere. And it just throws the whole thing into chaos. Like, it's acknowledging the original joke, but then they're twisting it and making it funny on, like, a whole other level.
And that rapid-fire joke delivery,
Yeah.
it just keeps you guessing. It'll be a subtle reference to some horror cliche 1 minute, and then bam, some totally absurd gag the next. Like that scene where they're trying to move the body,
Oh, yeah.
and they all grab a different limb,
Oh, my God, that's so good.
like a cartoon.
Total slapstick. You'd never see something like that in Scream.
Nope. And I think it was a very deliberate choice by the Wayans brothers
Ugh.
to use all that physical comedy, all that absurdity. And it gives the movie its own visual style.
Yeah, and you can definitely see the Wayans brothers style all over it.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, all the over-the-top characters.
Yeah.
All those weed jokes. And just moments of pure ridiculousness.
It's like they perfected a formula over the years.
Yeah.
You can see it from In Living Color all the way to Don't Be a Menace.
Totally. And it's interesting, though, because their humor is super broad, but it's also kind of edgy. Like, they push boundaries and make fun of sensitive topics.
Which, well, that's where things get a little tricky.
Yeah.
The video essay mentions how some of those jokes, especially the ones about Ray's sexuality or Officer Doofy, haven't aged that well.
Yeah. It's true. Watching it now, those jokes are uncomfortable, even cringy. I think it just shows how much our sense of humor changes over time.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
What might have seemed edgy or provocative 20 years ago can land very differently today.
Yeah. It reminds you that comedy is really a product of its time.
More than any other genre, I think.
Yeah. Speaking of the times, Scary Movie is basically a time capsule of the late 90s and early 2000s.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's not just referencing horror movies, it's making fun of everything. Boy bands, Dawson's Creek, those Wassup commercials that were, like, everywhere.
Totally. It's like they captured a specific moment in time, all those anxieties and obsessions that were just under the surface of pop culture.
Like that obsession with hard, booty-ass white women. The essay brings that up, and looking back, it's hilarious and kind of disturbing how common that was.
It's true. And it shows how even a parody can give us a glimpse into the cultural norms and values of a specific era.
So we've talked about the parody on parody, the rapid-fire jokes, the Wayans brothers style, but what's really impressive is how they blended elements from a ton of different horror movies into one story that actually makes sense.
That's one of the things that sets it apart from all the bad parody movies that came after. It actually tells a story. A really absurd one, but still.
Yeah. Like the transition from the Scream stuff to the I Know What You Did Last Summer stuff is actually really smooth. Totally. It's like they took all these different parts, recognizable scenes and characters, and just blended them into something new.
Right. It shows their skill as storytellers,
Yeah.
even when they're being totally absurd.
And speaking of unexpected, can we talk about Ghostface's rap verse? Where did that even come from?
It's such a great example of how they subvert expectations. You think you know what's coming, and then bam, something totally out of left field.
And it works because it fits their world. It's so ridiculous, but it just makes sense in the world of Scary Movie.
Exactly. Like they created this alternate universe where anything can happen.
Yeah, and we're just along for the ride.
And that's just the beginning of our deep dive.
There's still so much to unpack. So many layers to this comedic onion.
So many layers. So welcome back. We've been talking about all the layers of parody in Scary Movie and the Wayans brothers' comedic style. But I think it's worth talking a little more about their legacy. The essay makes a point about how they're really good at both, like innovating A&D, sticking with a formula.
Yeah. I mean, you can definitely see their signature all over the film.
Right.
Like all the weed jokes and the crazy characters, even the running gag of hurting old ladies. That's classic Wayans.
Totally.
But then they also blend that with this really sharp satire. They're poking fun at horror movies, pop culture, and even touchy social issues.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes them such interesting comedic figures. It's like they're walking this line between being edgy and delivering those familiar laughs. Like, remember their work on In Living Color?
Oh, yeah, of course.
They were dealing with race, politics, gender, all within these super creative sketches.
Right. And they weren't afraid to make people uncomfortable, like using humor to start conversations about important things.
Yeah,
And you can definitely feel that same energy in Scary Movie, even if some of it misses the mark.
absolutely. It's important to remember that this movie is a product of its time,
For sure.
and some of those jokes just haven't aged well. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge that the Wayans brothers were, a lot of times, trying to challenge stereotypes,
Right.
even if they didn't always do it perfectly.
It's like they were trying to show us how ridiculous some things are by exaggerating them.
Exactly.
Oh.
And that's where the power of parody comes in. It lets you take something familiar, something we think we understand, and then twist it, turn it on its head, and suddenly we see it in a new way.
Like they're taking those classic horror movie tropes and running them through this crazy Wayans filter.
Totally.
You've got Cindy, the final girl, who's actually pretty badass. Then you've got Brenda, who's like a walking subversion of that sassy black friend stereotype.
And of course, Shorty, who's, always high, but somehow manages to help solve the mystery. They're playing with these familiar archetypes, but also adding something unexpected.
It's like they're saying, yeah, we know these are cliches, but we can do something more interesting with them.
Right. It's not just mocking or tearing things down. It's about finding the humor in the familiar and turning expectations on their head.
Like they love the horror genre, but they're also making fun of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's why Scary Movie works so well. It's not just a cheap knockoff.
Totally agree.
Oh, you know what's interesting? The essay mentions a couple of things from behind the scenes. Did you know that Aaliyah was almost Brenda?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Can you imagine?
I can't. I mean, Regina Hall is so perfect in that role.
I know. I can't see anyone else doing it. And another thing, the movie was originally going to be set in a high school,
Oh, wow.
but they changed it to a college after Columbine.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
It was probably a good call given what happened. They could still have the over-the-top humor without it seeming, insensitive.
Right. It shows that they were aware of the cultural climate. They were willing to adapt, which honestly, a lot of those later parody movies just didn't do.
Yeah. Thinking back to the late 90s and early 2000s, it was such a specific time for pop culture.
Yeah.
And Scary Movie just captures that era perfectly.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's like a time capsule of all the stuff we were into. Boy bands, Dawson's Creek, that whole Wassup thing.
Totally. And looking back now, it's funny and kind of embarrassing.
It is.
But that's what makes it so fascinating, right?
Yeah.
It reminds us that our sense of humor is influenced by everything around us. What we think is funny now might be completely different from what we laughed at 20 years ago.
Totally. And it brings up some important conversations. Because Scary Movie, as funny as it is, also has some jokes that just don't work today.
Definitely. We've talked about the jokes about Ray and Officer Doofy, and of course there's the focus on, very particular body type. That feels pretty outdated now.
For sure.
It makes you think about how humor evolves and how what was once considered okay can become offensive over time.
It really makes you question the role of comedy, too. Should it always push boundaries? Should it reflect society or challenge it? I don't know. It's a tough question.
Absolutely. And I think Scary Movie is such a good example of how comedy can be both progressive and problematic, sometimes at the same time. It's a movie that makes us laugh, but also makes us think.
Yeah. It makes us think about how humor can be used to reinforce stereotypes or to break them down.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're not just looking at a funny movie. We're looking at a piece of culture that reflects a specific moment in time,
With all its complexities.
all its complexities and contradictions.
So we've covered a lot. The Wayans brothers' legacy, how humor changes over time, the whole cultural context of the late 90s, early 2000s. But we still haven't answered the big question. Did Scary Movie have a lasting impact?
It was a huge box office hit. It brought back the parody genre, but did it really change comedy? Did it change pop culture as a whole? That's what we're going to explore in the last part of our deep dive. All right, so welcome back. We spent this whole deep dive looking at what makes Scary Movie so funny, its cultural impact, and of course, the Wayans brothers' style. But now it's time for the big question. What kind of impact did this movie actually have long term?
Yeah, because it wasn't just a hit, it was like huge. I mean, everyone was quoting it back in the day. So did it like change the game for parodies or was it more of a like one hit wonder?
Well, it brought back the parody genre, for sure, at least for a bit. The video essay talks about how a bunch of parody movies came out after Scary Movie.
Oh, yeah.
But, and this is important, they weren't nearly as successful.
Yeah, those are the ones like epic movie and disaster movie, right?
Exactly. They felt like they were just trying to copy Scary Movie, not really making fun of anything specific.
Right, like they were just trying to make a quick buck.
And that's the difference. Scary Movie had an actual point of view.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just throwing random pop culture references around. It was using those references to say something about what we were all watching and obsessed with back then.
The essay says a lot of those other parodies felt like they were made by people who didn't even really like the stuff they were making fun of.
Totally.
It's like if a friend who knows you really well roasts you, it's funny, right?
Yeah.
But if someone who barely knows you roasts you, it's just mean.
That's a perfect analogy. Good parody comes from a place of, well, maybe it's like a twisted affection. Like you have to understand the source material, you know?
To make fun of it well.
Exactly. So if they were making Scary Movie today, what do you think they'd make fun of?
Ooh, that's a good question.
What horror movies would they target? Or even like broader cultural trends? Like you have that whole elevated horror thing these days.
Yeah.
Like movies like Hereditary or The Babadook.
Uh-huh.
Those use horror to talk about serious stuff.
Deep stuff.
Yeah. So imagine the Wayans brothers' take on that. With all their over-the-top craziness and physical comedy.
Oh my God. I can just picture it. Shorty trying to talk to a demon using a Ouija board made out of a bong or something.
Right. Or what about those horror movies that are all about social media?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Like Unfriended.
Host.
Yeah. Brenda trying to escape a ghost during a Zoom call, and Shorty's in the background making a TikTok.
Stop, stop. It's too good. Now I want to see that movie. It's crazy how, even after all these years, Scary Movie still feels relevant, right? We're still talking about what's okay in comedy, how humor changes, and how much pop culture influences us.
And I think that's why the film has had such a lasting impact.
Yeah.
It made us question what we find funny. It made us think about how humor can bring people together or tear them apart.
It's a lot to think about. But that's why this deep dive has been so fun. We're not just talking about a silly movie. We're talking about something that says a lot about our culture.
Exactly. And by thinking about all the jokes in the context, we can understand humor better,
How it works.
how it changes,
Yeah.
and how it shapes the way we see the world.
So to wrap up this whole deep dive, let's ask our listeners, what would your version of Scary Movie look like today?
Yeah.
What trends would you make fun of? What kind of jokes would you make?
Because the best parodies are the ones that make you think and laugh and, yeah, maybe feel a little uncomfortable.
And on that note, we'll let you ponder that. Thanks for joining us as we took a trip into the world of Scary Movie.
Yeah, it's been a fun ride.